Hello everyone. This video is going to dive into some of the different public policy responses that governments can have towards monopolies. So why might the government want to get involved when it comes to monopolies? Well, when it comes to monopolies, the government could claim that maybe the price that a monopoly is charging is too high, is unfair to consumers, and that the monopoly is, trying to take advantage of people by charging a price that is very high, particularly when it's a monopoly that's, maybe creating or producing a necessity for people. So there are four main different public policy responses that we're going to cover in this video. So let's go ahead and dive right into these four different public policy responses. So one public policy response that a government can have towards monopolies is what's called antitrust laws. So basically what these laws are laws that prevent mergers. They could break up companies if they start, acting like a monopoly or getting too big. So basically these antitrust laws can be enacted to increase competition or break up really, really big firms that may start to act like a monopoly. Two very famous antitrust laws are the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. So these two laws, enacted over 100 years ago, were put in place, again, to break up really big companies and prevent companies from, coordinating their activities to try to make markets less competitive. So one way that the government could get involved with monopolies, if the government thinks that these monopolies are being unfair or unreasonable in terms of, what price they're charging or what quantity they're producing, is that the government can almost force competition by law by passing an antitrust law. Another way that the government can step in terms of kind of controlling a monopoly firm would be direct regulation. In most cases, one way that the government can regulate the behavior of a monopolist is to just say, hey, you only have to charge this amount for the good or the service that you're providing. And this is actually quite common in the cases of natural monopolies. So for example, a natural monopoly might be one where the production process makes it such that only one electric company runs all the wires for a specific town or a city or a county or a whole region. If this is the case, that by the natural production process, only one firm runs all the electrical wires for an entire part of a state, then it makes sense for the government to step in and kind of regulate the price that this one company is able to charge. So this is usually the case when it comes to natural monopolies. Again, the regulator might even subsidize the monopolist because of this. They say, hey, if you charge this price, a price that is kind of similar to if there were more competitors competing with you, if you charge this lower price, then we might subsidize you in some way, cut you a check for complying with this regulation. So a government could pass a law, or they can just directly regulate a monopoly. Another thing that sometimes happens with monopolies and the government intervening in this situation would just be public ownership. So basically, the government could, in the case of the electric company, say, hey, you private individuals, you private company, you are no longer private. We, the government, are going to be in charge of this company and make all the decisions for this company. So by directly owning the company, the government could then set the production quantity and the price, et cetera, et cetera. Most of the time, I have here on the slide, that public ownership is usually less efficient than if the business was privately owned, just because there's really no incentive to minimize the cost. So if the government is the owner of this business, then there's not really any kind of incentive for the government to spend less money or to lower costs. Versus if it was a private individual owning the company, there may be more at stake for that private individual to actually want to minimize costs. If they have, a family to feed, etc., they don't want to, make too little profits on that margin. But, the government has money coming in from taxpayers, seemingly unlimited money. So there's not really any incentive for the government to cut down on costs as much. But public ownership is one option that the government can pursue if it wants to kind of regulate monopolies and keep the market, as fair or as competitive as possible. And then the last thing that is worth mentioning is that a public policy that the government could have towards monopolies is just doing nothing, not doing anything in terms of regulating or telling the monopoly what it can and cannot produce, or what it can and cannot charge for the production of a good or a service. So again, some economists like to argue that it is often best for the government not to try to remedy the inefficiencies of monopoly pricing. It's better that the government just kind of keep their hands off and let the monopolists charge whatever price that they would charge, because if the government does step in, it could, be less efficient and maybe make even more problems down the road. So again, this kind of goes back to this idea that we talked about a little bit in class now months ago, when we talked about, positive thinking versus normative thinking. And, economists usually try to lean towards more positive ways of analyzing things. Economists try to say, this is how the world is, and this is how the world is working. This is how these two variables interact with one another. Not necessarily, we should be doing this. We should be meddling here, but not here. We should do this. So again, economists try to stay away from these more normative, more opinionated statements about particularly the interaction of politics and the economy. So again, just to recap these different public policies, the government can pass a law. These laws are called antitrust laws. The government can directly regulate the behavior of the monopoly. The government could outright own the monopoly company, or the government could just do nothing. So the last little bit of information I want to cover in this video talks about, the prevalence of monopolies in the real world. And kind of like, the perfectly competitive market structure, a pure, perfect monopoly is very rare in the real world. A lot of times we don't have one single firm making all of a good or a service. Sometimes we have two or three or four, really, really big firms competing, but not one. So this pure monopoly case that we've covered in these videos is very rare in the real world. Just like a purely perfect competitive situation is also very rare in the real world. But a lot of the ideas that we covered throughout these videos are, still very relevant when we translate what we learned in these videos to looking at how the world is actually working. And many firms really do have market power by either, selling a unique variety of a product or having a large market share and few significant competitors. So like I just mentioned, even though one firm selling all of our good or service, even though that's pretty rare, there are firms that exist that have market power, the ability to set the price higher than their marginal revenue and their marginal cost. So again, if this is the case, there are firms that are able to have this markup, which does cause a deadweight loss, which does cause a depletion in total surplus or total welfare for everyone. So these ideas that we learned throughout these videos are important to keep in mind when we analyze firms in the real world. And I think the videos that we're going to talk about next week when we introduce monopolistic competition and oligopoly, these ideas that we learned in purely perfect competition and pure monopoly will help us better analyze these two different market structures that are in the middle of the spectrum or are more likely to happen in the real world. So that is all I have for this video. In the next video of this series, we're going to be going through the last slide of the lecture notes that talks about some of the similarities and the differences between pure competition and pure monopoly.